Thank you, Joe, and thank all of you for being here tonight. It's so exciting to get to be here and share my work with you. I've had a really lovely couple of days here at Quarry Farm, and I'm sure probably everyone in this room would agree that there's no better place to write about Mark Twain than here in Elmira. So let's get started.
Jessica, could you speak in the microphone?
Sure. Is that better?
Yes. No.
Yes, no? I'll get closer. Is this better now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. I'll be sure, just tell me if I am drifting away and I'll come back. So if you ask a literary critic about the American subscription book market, the conversation will almost inevitably turn to one figure, Mark Twain. John Tebble estimates that this method was responsible for up to 2/3 of all books sold between 1870 and 1900. And while this number seems almost improbably high, it is undeniable that subscription bookselling was extremely popular. Yet Twain's career is one of the few contexts in which this practice receives scholarly attention. Not without reason. Twain was both a subscription book-selling wunderkind. He sold more than 80,000 copies of 1869's The Innocents Abroad in just a year and a half through this method. And he was also a favorite of the literary establishment, who considered him an exception to the low-quality offerings they believed typified the subscription business. Even so, the emphasis on a single author has resulted in a corresponding failure to account fully for this pervasive and diverse system. This neglect encompasses both figures besides Twain, who operated within the subscription market, and the method's broader significance to 19th century literary culture, especially its unique relationship to American geography. Nor is Twain's scholarship exempt from the consequences of his overexposure, which has resulted in the perpetuation of the inaccurate claim that The Gilded Age, co-written with Charles Dudley Warner and published in 1873, was the first novel sold by subscription. The prevalence of this claim reveals crucial oversights in our understanding of the possibilities of the subscription market, including both fiction's relationship to this popular mode of distribution and the gendered biases which have contributed to Twain's historical and critical dominance. In 1866, 7 years before the appearance of The Gilded Age, agents were soliciting orders for Tried and True, or Love and Loyalty, a story of the Great Rebellion by Bella Zilpha Spencer. Spencer's name is unfamiliar to us now, but her novel was a moderate success, reprinted several times until at least 1879. Pitting Spencer against the legendary Mark Twain, we already begin to see how easily this earlier appearance of subscription fiction was overshadowed by Twain's prominence. Spencer was 26 when she published Tried and True and died only a year later, though the notice of her death taken in the publisher's circular suggests that the novel had secured her the beginnings of a respectable literary career. By contrast, Twain was in his late 30s when he and Warner penned The Gilded Age, riding high off the success of The Innocents Abroad and Roughing It, both travelogues sold by subscription, and he was already a savvy businessman with a lifelong involvement in the publishing trade. Genre, too, is probably significant. Tried and True is a sentimental romance inspired by Spencer's own nursing career during the Civil War, while The Gilded Age is a political and social satire. The distance between Twain and Spencer, and between the perceived value of their literary output, is a difference long policed by cultural critics, and one that's strikingly visible on the subscription market. Writing in 1910, journalist and playwright George Odd recalls the heyday of the old-time subscription book, from which he considered Mark Twain's offerings a welcome reprieve in content, if not form. He complains that the book was always the same: many pages, numerous steel engravings, curlicue tailpieces, platitudes, patriotism, poetry, sentimental mush, before going on to lavishly praise Twain's books, which, though they looked at a distance just like the other distended, diluted, and altogether tasteless volumes, contained stories of humor and adventure that captivated the country boys and small town boys all over America. Odd's recollection dramatizes the two categories which have traditionally defined conversations about subscription bookselling. There's Mark Twain, and there's everything else. Among his dismissive litany of typical subscription fare is the ambiguous cluster of sentimental mush, a category capacious enough to include tried and true. We should note, too, that the literary values implicit in Odd's comments are gendered ones, prioritizing the reading pleasure of boys and men over that of women and their trivial mush. These priorities are ones which have shaped both Spencer's legacy and the legacy of subscription bookselling. In recuperating Spencer and her novel, my aim is not to substitute tried and true for the Gilded Age in claims about the first novel sold by subscription. Instead, I hope to show how such a claim belies the untapped potential of the subscription market as a source for understanding the 19th century literary marketplace. I want to point out, too, the intimate connection between Tried and True's sentimental identity and its circulation as a subscription book. Tried and True is more than just fodder for debunking a relatively minor piece of trivia about Mark Twain's career. The emphasis on Twain, and to a lesser degree his publisher Eliza Bliss, means that the company of the history of subscription bookselling has thus far largely been defined by the contributions of charismatic men. Written by a female author, in a female genre, for a female audience, and, as I will discuss later, sold by female agents, Tried and True in its circulation embodied common anxieties and resentments about women's control of literary markets and the threat of their growing agency to traditional ideas about gender and domesticity. Such anxieties are heightened by the social disruptions of the Civil War and its immediate aftermath, a context which likewise prompts further considerations of the role of American landscapes in making meaning from the subscription market and the volumes sold there. While documentation of the subscription market is both scarce and scattered, it's not difficult to verify Tried and True's life there, suggesting that we have not yet taken full intellectual advantage of the materials which have survived. But before we get into that, I want to begin with a short introduction to how subscription bookselling worked, because a lot of people aren't super familiar with this mode of distribution, even though it was so popular. So selling books by subscription wasn't a new phenomenon, even in America. Many writers in the 18th and early 19th centuries had sought to obtain financial support for their works in this way, often as a route to independent publication, and it had long been a reliable tactic for selling textbooks. Like so much in the late 19th century, what was new was the scale at which this enterprise was carried out after the Civil War. The industry became sleek and professionalized, streamlined to conquer the great expanse of American territory that lay between Boston and San Francisco. Publishers, many of whom dealt solely in subscription books, allocated to each agent a specific geographic area in which to operate, relying on them to canvass their assigned regions with a thoroughness that benefited them both. As one 1902 publisher letter insists, "All classes and conditions want the book. You cannot tell who will buy or will not buy unless you call on every one. Call at every house, every store, every office, every workshop." In return, the agent was ostensibly guaranteed that he would face no competition from others selling the same or similar titles. And this was an efficient system. It was so efficient, in fact, that it drew the ire of trade publishers who suspected that the armies of book agents peddling their wares directly to customers were hurting sales in more traditional venues like bookstores. In retaliation, trade publishers and bookstore owners publicly lambasted the quality of books offered by subscription, decrying them as ugly, overpriced, and without literary value. But such critiques did nothing to slow the extraordinary sales of the subscription business, though they early on set the precedent for more serious connoisseurs of literature to dismiss subscription books altogether. For all the rumblings of the trade market, however, the newly energized subscription business was solving one of American publishing's oldest obstacles: distribution. In his 1905 treatise, A Publisher's Confession, senior partner in Doubleday, Page & Co., Walter Hines Page, summarizes the attitude of a trade long frustrated by the difficulties of marketing books across America's vast landscape, writing, There are throughout the land another 100,000 persons who would buy any novel, of which 100,000 have been sold, if they could see the book and hear about it, if it were intelligently kept for sale where they would see it. The problem was that places where books could be intelligently kept for sale were apparently few and far between. Many small towns and rural areas lacked bookstores, and those regions that did have book vendors still faced the not insignificant obstacle of convincing people to patronize them. Subscription booksellers who brought books directly to potential customers, wherever they might be, had a distinct advantage. There's one agent who even reports successfully canvassing both a remote California logging camp and an insane asylum. So as you might imagine, book agents became notorious for their ubiquity and their skill at eliciting orders. If Page and other publishers imagined a country with unlimited consumers for books, agents were building that market one customer at a time. So on this slide, you can see an example of a sample book that agents would use when they went door to door. These sample books contained portions of the forthcoming book, usually some of its most exciting features. It would have a table of contents, it would have several sample illustrations, it would have binding options the customer could choose from, and as you see here, blank pages on which the agents could take down customers' orders. And then you can see here the way that binding samples were incorporated into these too. So the agent could bring the book to you and say, oh, well, which do you like better, the blue or the red? And sort of sweet talk their way into getting you to buy a book. One of the most crucial mechanisms to consider is subscription bookselling's reliance on the physical transversal of space. So the ideal subscription network encompasses all of America's real geography, a correspondence with heightened significance in a century of tumultuous conflict and expansion. The emergence of a large-scale subscription industry coincided with a major identity crisis for the still young nation. Whatever collective vision of America that existed before 1861 had been obliterated by the scale of the violence and ideological rupture that literally tore the country apart. The war severed regions of the country not just from each other, but from any illusion of a shared national feeling, a chasm that required quick repair. Though with higher stakes than the expanded book market eagerly pursued by 19th century publishers, both efforts were circumscribed by remarkably similar terms. Both relied on a deft navigation of America's regional differences and undertaking both physical and ideological. And as agents dispersed across the country, they peddled not just books, but also a shared understanding of the war's events, significance, and status as history. Notably, the early subscription market was dominated by Civil War-related titles, so much so that by 1868, new subscription offerings were frequently being advertised as not a war book. Tried and True, by contrast, was a war book, as you can see from one of its few illustrations here on this slide. A categorization that may have helped hasten its path to obscurity, lumped in as it was with biographies of generals, accounts of battles, and other war-related materials. In her history of subscription bookselling, Marjorie Stafford catalogs dozens of titles in this vein. 4 Years in Secessia, The Field, The Prison, and Escape by Junius Henry Brown, Pictorial History of the Rebellion by Anne S. Stevens, Grant and Sherman, Their Campaigns and Generals by J.T. Headley, and Women of the War by Frank Moore are just a few representative titles of the type of sort of nonfiction book that was circulating in the immediate years after the Civil War. Where Tried and True distinguished itself was in its fictionality, a sharp contrast to other Civil War books sold by subscription. It was a novel, part of a genre that was becoming notorious for its compulsive readability. Instead of encasing the war in the textual equivalent of a tombstone, because another frequent complaint about subscription books is that people would buy them and then never read them, Tried and True invites its readers into an ongoing, effective reenactment, memorializing the war not through details or dates, but emotional storytelling. While it's not clear if Tried and True was the only subscription novel in circulation immediately after the Civil War, subscription fiction was apparently relatively rare, even later in the century. By most accounts, the bulk of subscription offerings were comprised of anthologies of poetry or historical facts, deportment guides, weighty biographies of more or less interesting statesmen, practical medical or agricultural manuals, or ornate Bibles, though Keith Arbour has argued that this widespread perception represents the breadth and quality of subscription offerings remarkably inaccurately. Fiction's scarcity on the subscription market is partly to blame for the outsized share of attention Mark Twain has received in our histories of it, as the only canonical author associated with the trade. This trend, too, is an anomaly in our understanding of a period where fiction's popularity was skyrocketing. Though books of all types and genres contributed to a general sense that the country was being overrun by printed matter in the late 19th century, fiction was the most popular. By contrast, the absence of novels on the subscription market helped fuel the ire of anti-subscription critics like William Dean Howells, who wrote in defense of Twain, a personal friend, in 1893, that no book of literary quality was made to go by subscription except Mr. Samuel Clemens's books. And I think these went because the subscription public never knew what good literature they were. This sort of readers, or buyers, were so used to getting something worthless for their money that they would not spend it for artistic fiction, or indeed any fiction at all, except Mr. Clemens's, which they probably supposed bad. Howells dismisses the subscription public as buyers rather than readers, a comment which evokes one of the most common criticisms aimed at subscription books, that people were drawn to their physical attributes rather than to the quality of their content. As a result, many critiques dwelled almost obsessively on subscription volumes as physical objects rather than as literary ones. An 1872 article from the Publishers and Stationers Weekly Trade Circular is typical of the abuse heaped upon subscription books. It derides their gorgeous bindings, usually in very bad taste, thick but cheap paper, outrageously poor woodcuts, and the largest type with the thickest leads, all of which culminated in a very big, gaudy book which a glib tongue or persistent boring cheats folks into buying at $5 when the reading matter which it contains, if worth anything, would make about $1.50 book in the regular trade. So really, they have a very bad reputation. Twain's reputation and the reputation of the Gilded Age is intimately linked with this long-standing pattern of representation, and not just because Howells provides an early model for critical dismissal of subscription works other than Twain's. A likely origin for the misinformation about the Gilded Age being the first novel sold by subscription is Hamlin Hill's 1964 monograph, Mark Twain and Elisha Bliss, in which Hill asserts that no subscription house ventured to publish a novel before the American Publishing Company released The Gilded Age in 1873. Hill fails to source this claim, but he may have been influenced by an 1874 review of the novel, shown here on this slide, and cited elsewhere in Mark Twain and Elisha Bliss, in which the author opens by declaring that The Gilded Age is a story, and it is, moreover, the first instance, so far as we know, of a storybook issued by subscription. Yet, as Hill himself notes, Twain's writings received an unusual amount of press attention for subscription books, and it wouldn't have been difficult for previous storybooks to have escaped the reviewer's notice. The narrative that emerges is a narrative of exceptions. An exceptional author with exceptional status in public and in print who innovates exceptionally through an all too mundane method of circulation. So I want to take a little time now to share some more information about Mark Twain's relationship to the subscription market. His early success with this method of book selling came via his relationship with the American Publishing Company, a subscription house based out of Hartford. This relationship began in 1867 when Elisha Bliss, then the manager of the APC, wrote to Twain suggesting that the author try his hand at writing subscription books. The result was Innocents Abroad, which agents began canvassing for in the summer of 1869. As already mentioned, the subscription method proved wildly successful for Twain, And he would continue to write most of his books with the subscription market in mind until 1895. Innocents Abroad was followed by Roughing It, The Gilded Age, and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, among others. So on this side, you can see the books Twain issued with the APC between 1869 and 1880. Working with both Elijah Bliss and his son and business partner, Frank Bliss, Twain became heavily invested in the production of his subscription books, offering input on their illustration, design, marketing, and other fine details. So he was really invested, not just in writing the book, but in what the physical book was going to look like when people started buying it. So at this point, a couple of important things happen. In 1880, Elijah Bliss, who had become president of the American Publishing Company soon after he began working with Twain, dies. Bliss's death was the impetus for Twain to leave the APC, where business tensions had been growing for the past few years. But even so, he wasn't ready to leave subscription bookselling behind. In 1884, Twain founds his own subscription business, Charles L. Webster & Co., which was named for his niece's husband, Charles Webster, who Twain also installed as the business manager of the new firm. And for the next 10 years, he published his works through his own firm, auspiciously beginning, as you can see, with Huckleberry Finn. Two other notable publications by Charles Webster & Co. were 1885's Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, which was a huge runaway success, and 1895's A Library of American Literature from the Earliest Settlement to the Present Times, which was an ambitious multi-volume anthology of American literature that unfortunately, combined with some unlucky investments on Twain's part, bankrupted the company and ended Twain's career as a subscription publisher. But after the Charles Webster Company failed, Twain's finances were on shaky ground, and he returned to the APC and published several more books by subscription over the next decade. So while there were ups and downs in his subscription bookselling career, it's undeniable that he was heavily involved in the subscription business for over 30 years. So another fun relic of Twain's interest in the subscription market is his unfinished burlesque of Hamlet, in which Twain leaves the text of Shakespeare's famous play exactly the same, except for inserting a new character, a book agent named Basil Stockmar. He began this project in August 1881 right here at Quarry Farm, which I discovered while writing this. I thought that was very cool, but abandoned it 3 days later and only made it to the middle of Act 2. But if you're interested, you can read that fragment in Franklin R. Rogers' collection of Mark Twain's satires and burlesques, and you may also want to check out Keith Arbor's helpful article on it. I've included references to both of those sources here on this slide. Mark Twain was also closely associated with subscription bookselling in the eyes of the public. So this is just a really fun thing I like to share. In 1911, a writer called Elizabeth Lindley published a short account about her experiences as a book agent, mostly about her failure to make any money and the many, many inappropriate romantic propositions she receives while canvassing. But she also includes an account of being tricked into trying to sell a set of Mark Twain's works to Samuel Clemens, not realizing that they are the same person. Supposedly, Twain took pity on her and ordered a set of his own books to be delivered to his mischievous friend who had sent Lindley on this errand. Conveniently, Lindley's account was published a year after Mark Twain died, so he wasn't around to refute it. I think it's probably unlikely that it's true, but it does show how closely Twain's name was associated with subscription books, even in the early 20th century. So we can see that there are many good reasons why Mark Twain received so much attention in the history of subscription bookselling. And while The Gilded Age may not have been the first novel written for subscription sale, it can boast of being one of the few, and perhaps the only, subscription books to unite form and content as part of a continuous artistic project. Twain and Warner's tale of financial speculation and political corruption lent its name to the tumultuous decades of the late 19th century, exemplifying within its pages the nation's apprehensions about authenticity and artificiality in an era where old metrics of distinguishing true and false were rapidly deteriorating. These anxieties were echoed in the arena of literary value, where decorative signifiers formerly reserved for costly or high-quality volumes were applied indiscriminately, adorning the most revered tombs of Dickens and Shakespeare, and fashionable, forgettable novels of the moment alike. This surge in sumptuously decorated books that were both affordable and ubiquitous threatened to destabilize established values not only of literary quality, but also its appropriate or accepted physical forms. In book culture, nowhere was this crisis more apparent than in the volumes offered on the subscription market, of which the Gilded Age was example par excellence. In her reading of The Gilded Age, Susanna Ashton suggests that Twain uses the book's physical form to extend the novel's critique of artificiality. She makes her case using the novel's infamous chapter headings, written in an impressively diverse range of languages, and often selected from intentionally arcane sources by Twain's Hartford neighbor, scholar J. Hammond Trumbull. So you can see on this slide a few examples of these chapter headings, rendered in obscure languages. These headings, rendered in elaborate scripts of Hebrew, Arabic, and Greek, among others, would have been largely undecipherable to the book's customers. They simultaneously represent overwhelming erudition, but also vapid cultural capital. In this way, the novel exploits the public's desire for proximity to the knowledge books were purported to embody, while also critiquing the foundations on which that reputation is made. What appears to be a signifier of education and culture is revealed as a stunt, exposing such signifiers' empty value when divorced of meaning. Other features, like the 30-inch fold-out map of a proposed railway line, further imply the author's familiarity with the nuances of subscription bookselling and the gimmicks typically employed to wheedle sales out of unwary customers. Like other subscription books, The Gilded Age was an impressively gaudy production, offered by agents in a variety of increasingly lavish bindings. Such trappings were a crucial part of these volumes' marketability. Through the physical attributes of a novel that is itself about the dubious possibility of authenticity in an age defined by greed and corruption, Twain and Warner staged the slippage between literary and commercial value ravaging book culture in the late 19th century. The novel's self-conscious status as a subscription book also allows room for Twain and Warner to express skepticism over the widely held belief that peddling books door to door was inherently inferior to selling them within a bookstore. In one chapter of the novel, Laura Hawkins, who is a beautiful but increasingly more corrupt young woman central to the story's chronicle of shady Washington dealings, passes the time in a bookstore while waiting to meet with one of her congressional contacts. The hapless store clerk fails repeatedly to recognize or locate the books Laura requests. Quickly sensing that she will be better off left to her own devices, Laura attempts to browse on her own, only to be constantly interrupted by the clerk's comically off-the-mark recommendations. This extra-textual interplay between the fictional scene of failed bookselling and the successful real-life subscription canvas that allowed the book to reach readers' hands flatters both the agents selling copies of The Gilded Age, on whom the financial success of the novel depended, and the volume's subscribers, whose own reading and book-buying habits are not implicated by the author's critique. Coupled with Mark Twain's literary celebrity, it's easy to see how this kind of deliberate interplay with the physical form of the subscription book might eclipse other novels offered via this method prior to 1873. Yet The Gilded Age's engagement with the subscription market, expressed as much in its bookness, its material form, as in its novelness, is not the only way we might conceive of a novel as being written for the subscription market. As an object, Tried and True cannot compare with Twain and Warner's explicit punning with their book's physical qualities. The first edition bears gilded lettering on its spine, a tissue-covered frontispiece of its author, and 3 engravings throughout. but it is relatively plain compared to the elaborate embellishments that would become common for subscription books over the next decade. What Tried and True offers instead is a means through which to understand how the post-Civil War reconciliation for which Spencer advocates is manifested in the land traversed by agents selling her novel. By attending not just to the form of subscription books, but to the form of their circulation, we expand the possibilities for understanding how subscription bookselling shaped America's literary landscapes in the late 19th century. Bella Z. Spencer, a nurse and Union general's wife, was part of a legion of women who turned to fiction in the war's immediate aftermath to process its horrors. This is another one of the illustrations from Tried and True. War writing by white women, suffused with sentimental treatments of nursing, home front privation, and family life, flooded American markets during and immediately after the Civil War. Later in the century, the importance of these novels began to be effaced by calls for realism, which privileged the male perspective as a participant in war over women's experiences of it. Tried and True is of a piece with these maligned and forgotten novels. Spencer's heroine is Estrella Harmon, a young Southern woman loyal to the Union, but sympathetic to wounded rebels and refugees, who finds herself caught up in the devastation and drama of the Civil War. Though inspired by Spencer's own nursing career, Estrella's experiences are embellished with melodramatic deathbed scenes, stirring accounts of battle, naughty love plots, a stake of mistaken identity caused by the appearance of a hitherto unknown twin brother, an earnest record of the horrors of slavery and war, and a duplicitous husband who takes a hand in Lincoln's assassination. So there's a lot going on in Tried and True. As might be expected of a narrative written in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, Tried and True is also grappling with complex questions of geography, a preoccupation matched by the conditions of the novel's production and sale. The subscription market had enormous potential as a unifying force, organized as it was around activating a vast network of canvassers responsible to publishers and their regional representatives. Tried and True is evidence of this coalition at work. Spencer writes her novel's preface from Philadelphia. Publisher W.J. Holland lists Springfield, Massachusetts as its base of operation, and one agent reports answering an ad in a Chicago newspaper before selling the book widely in the Midwest. America's fractured geography becomes the arena in which Spencer's novel will succeed or fail. Similarly decentralized, the story's action is divided between the front lines of Shiloh and Paducah, an Alabama plantation, Washington, D.C., and a New York townhouse. Estrella is born abroad but raised to adulthood in Alabama, the wife of a cruel plantation owner who is banished from her home when she refuses to cooperate with her husband's plans for secession. Her Southern ties are concealed both from the reader and from Estrella's Northern allies for the entire first half of the novel, and Estrella herself is curiously unmarked by geographic signifiers. Not only does the text remark that it is a wonder that Estrella failed to imbibe from her father and those around her the same false ideals of the Confederate cause, but her speech also bears no trace of a Southern upbringing. She doesn't have the accent that you would expect from somebody who had lived almost their entire life in Alabama in the 19th century. For Spencer, geographic identification is instead a matter of choice, an indicator of Estrella's moral fortitude. But we should note that this mode of self-formation is conspicuously unachievable for the African Americans characters in the novel, especially those enslaved on Estrella's family plantation. Estrella pities these people, but she never substantively helps them, and their own speech is usually represented by thick dialect in the text. Estrella herself cannot be tainted by regional geography, defined instead by her fervent patriotism. Neither Northern nor Southern, but decidedly American, she is the perfect spokeswoman for national unity. Yet the unity embodied by Estrella is one which requires white Americans left reeling in the conflict's wake to understand the war's core cause, the enslavement of millions of people, as fully resolved. Though the author cautions in her preface against believing that since the institution of slavery has been abolished, cruelty is at an end, her warning does not penetrate the novel proper, which conveniently loses track of its black characters at the conclusion of the war. Nor does the author overly concern herself with the harsh realities of slavery itself, admitting that she has, as much as possible, avoided going into the revolting details of those cruel abuses of the slave. Every Southern sympathizer will deny the truth of those stories, and every Northern heart is sick of contemplating them. She defers to another writer, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which cannot give any exaggerated idea of the truth for a record of this brutality. Her comments, again couched in geographic terms, expose a callously efficient strategy for reconciling Northern hearts and Southern sympathizers, erasing the issue that caused the rift in the first place. In the context of subscription bookselling, Spencer's active erasure becomes even more insidious, propelled by a mode of circulation which sought to encompass every house, every store, every office, and every workshop in America. As agents build a national book market, they're also peddling Spencer's vision of a whitewashed unity. While the novel's preoccupation with betrayal and duplicity hints at the complexity of restoring the wounded nation to a coherent whole, its narrative also suggests the most expedient route to reconciliation. It consistently espouses pro-union sentiments, buttressing the nation's authority to demand allegiance from its people, while also encouraging sympathy for Southern refugees and soldiers drafted into the Confederacy. By emphasizing the hardships of these demographics, Spencer insists that she does not exaggerate when she says that the refugees were more pitiable than the Negroes. The novel suggests that most Southerners have been punished enough by the war's devastation. Their past transgressions, she suggests, must be confined to history if the country is to move forward. Tried and True recruits readers to its cause through the physical transversal of space, which draws agents and clients alike into an act of literary reconstruction, whereby the nation is reconstituted through their experience of the novel, which cultivates a shared sentiment about their collective traumatic past. More than just memorializing the war as a historical event, the text offers a way forward for the future. Years before the title of Twain and Warner's novel would become shorthand for a period ravaged by anxieties about artificiality, Spencer employs fiction itself as a kind of gilding, as cheap and shining as that on any spine or covered, applied ever so carefully over the nation's ugliest cracks and fissures along the routes that book agents followed, manifesting a coherent social reality from a shattered whole. But Tried and True cannot fully elide the extent of the Civil War's disruptive effects, ruptures that can be detected in the novel's thwarted sentimental overtures. Like subscription bookselling, some sentimental novels have long had a bad reputation, and their value, which lies largely in their centering of women's experiences as writers, readers, and subjects, has been recuperated only relatively recently, within the past 2 or 3 decades. This centering, I argue, contributed to the ease with which Tried and True was forgotten in historical accounts of the subscription market, while also motivating some of the novel's most interesting work. Spencer's narrative veneer may have been effective in glossing over issues white Americans were all too happy to leave behind, but was less successful in disguising seismic disturbances in the social landscape of gender and domesticity, changes detectable both in the novel's structure and the context of its circulation. Sentimental fiction was a thriving genre for female writers, a demographic with a 19th century reputation nearly as questionable as that of the subscription market itself. Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1855 invective about the damned mob of scribbling women is probably only the most famous of the century's bitter rumblings by prominent male writers and critics about women's domination of the literary market as both writers and readers. Though often neglected in historical and critical accounts of subscription bookselling, it's not difficult to excavate women's involvement with the trade. Beyond coverage in contemporary periodicals and archival evidence of canvassing books and prospectuses, some of the richest sources of information about America's 19th century subscription business are narrative accounts written by agents about their experiences. So we've already seen one example with Elizabeth Lindley's The Diary of a Book Agent, and you can see a few more on the right of this slide. Such accounts are relatively scarce, but provide an important bridge between a press intent on discrediting subscription bookselling and materials produced by subscription publishers for the purpose of selling books. Instead, these narratives offer insight into the practice as understood by agents and their customers, which is a valuable perspective even when we suspect that at certain moments, authors like Elizabeth Lindley might be embellishing the truth. I have identified 8 of these accounts published between 1854 and 1925, though likely others exist. Significantly, 7 of these 8 narratives are written by women, although women made up only a small fraction of the total agency workforce. The 1890 census records that they account for just 2.8% of all book agents. This disparity evokes Hawthorne's complaint about the prevalence of women writers, but it wasn't just their authorial ambitions that were a cause of unease. The subscription book business also required female agents to operate outside accepted parameters of social conduct for women. They traveled alone for long distances in both urban and rural areas, soliciting orders and collecting payment from men and women alike. Inappropriate advances from male customers are often recorded in their narratives, and one writer bitterly catalogs the many slights she receives from women of moral breeding who would never resort to such a conspicuous mode of gaining a livelihood. So in the Stereograph series on the left of this slide, we can see a young girl being spanked by her nurse for flirting with a book agent. So this suggests how the practice of subscription bookselling was one of the reasons it was considered suspect is because it created opportunities for illicit sexual behavior because you had a stranger who was granted access to the intimacy of the home. I don't think that seduction occurred in very many book canvases that agents were undertaking, but the opportunity for bad behavior contributed to subscription bookselling's bad reputation. So you can imagine that it was pretty risque for women to be involved in the practice. As historian Natalie Marine Street has demonstrated, while the occupation of book agent provided women with the unusual opportunity of making an independent living and earning equal wages, the public nature of the profession required a constant and precarious navigation of the bounds of respectability. A recent article by Jolie Braun likewise draws attention to these narratives' value as evidence of how the physical, psychological, and emotional exertion required from book agents is compounded when performed by women working within restrictive gender norms. It was not just these agents' abstract position as female authors that was a cause for concern, but also their embodied existence as women, especially when the volumes they offered were autobiographic, testaments to their unorthodox lifestyle. On the subscription market, the uneasy proximity between women and books becomes riskier than ever. More work remains to be done on these narratives, but one 1868 account is of special significance for the history of tried and true. In the eponymous Annie Nels, or The Life of a Book Agent, Annie Nels Dumond recounts her entry into the canvassing trade after responding to a newspaper ad seeking agents for the novel. And from Dumond's testimony, it's easy to document Tried and True's life as a subscription book. So on the slide, on the right of the slide, I've just put a red line next to the passage in The Life of a Book Agent where Dumond reports that she saw an ad for Tried and True. She answered the ad. That's how she became a book agent. Her account is supported by a one-page ad for Tried and True put out in 1866 by publisher W.J. Holland, touting Spencer's novelistic treatment of the choicest themes furnished by the late war and maintaining that the book is now ready for subscribers and sold only by subscription. While I have been able to locate little information about the history, origins, or fate of the W.J. Holland Company, all evidence suggests that the company published at least primarily and probably exclusively for the subscription market. By some metrics, Odd's moniker of sentimental mush is a fitting one for Spencer's novel, which was not only sold by female agents, but also firmly situated in a genre long associated with women and long dismissed by men like Odd. Astrea herself certainly fits the role of sentimental heroine with her inhuman beauty and piety, as does the narrative's unwavering obsession with morality and a marked propensity in all characters for bursting into tears. Yet while the sentimental mode may have provided the blueprint for tried and true, the genre is an uneasy fit for the lived experience of wartime. The conflict forces Estrella to abandon the realm of the domestic, fleeing an abusive husband to travel alone to the masculine-coded spaces of the front line. Like Dumond and other female book agents, she is thrust into circulation beyond the bounds of respectability, and like them, must navigate the social consequences. The implacable stoicism with which Estrella endures cannon fire, aids in gruesome amputations, and confronts bleak scenes of death and destruction prompts the frequent reflection by other characters that she ought to have been a man, a declaration she forcefully rebukes. She says, "I am not manly simply because I have strength of will and self-control. In all domestic and social ills, the woman is stronger and more enduring than the man." Her defiance is grounded in more than maintaining the unassailable femininity required of a sentimental heroine. Or rather, her improbable perfection is, in this case, enabled by the novel's inability to suppress the all too real. So I want to share one scene which I think is a good example of this dynamic in the novel. During the Battle of Corinth, Estrella shelters in a hotel full of mangled and groaning sufferers, where the floors were literally covered with lifeless bodies, and there was scarcely a spot where they could step without treading in blood. The violence continues outside. A woman's scream rang out upon the air, and they looked upon a fearful scene just outside the door where lay the fragments of a human body. A soldier's wife had fled from the camp into the town. Frantic with alarm, she rushed out and was vainly essaying to find some other place of refuge when a shell hissed down before her and exploded with a crash, dashing her to pieces. In her preface, Spencer avows that for scenes like this, she has depended entirely upon memory. The shock of their graphic detail is an effect of reality intruding upon the sentimental ideal. Here you have your heroine. She's beautiful, devout, mistress of the domestic arts, and she's in the middle of a gruesome battlefield, which is not the scene of heroic acts, but of brutal violence against civilians and soldiers alike. Such moments are transgressions against a masculine aesthetic of war fiction, which Elizabeth Young argues developed in response to the women's prolific writing about the Civil War. This aesthetic privileges the authenticity of men's perspectives, a value in which women's war writing becomes a flagrant violation of gender norms. Yet Estrella's capabilities and experiences have an embedded authenticity of their own. They cannot be much exaggerated from what was regularly required of frontline nurses like Spencer, and only become exceptional within the context of the novel, which requires a heroine of special significance. Her enshrinement of these experiences within a work of fiction thus has a double effect. It both provides the center of the sentimental narrative, the exceptional heroine, Estrella, while simultaneously ensuring that any disruption of gender norms is safely relegated to the inauthentic, because this is fiction, right? It's not true. Tellingly, the threat of the autonomous woman is mirrored in accounts of female book agents like Nell's, who were responsible for selling Tried and True and other subscription books. Natalie Marine Street has tied women's work as canvassers to their burgeoning political and social agency in the second half of the 19th century, and it's possible to see the subscription market as an arena where gender roles, like the sentimental expectations of Tried and True, are subverted and recast to meet contemporary realities. While the Gilded Age pokes fun at subscription bookselling's foibles, a masterful burlesque of form, Spencer's Civil War romance demonstrates other ways we might imagine a novel as being written for a subscription market, ones which are earnestly, rather than satirically, engaged with the possibilities the structure of that market affords. Beyond its importance to this understudied history, Tried and True also demonstrates the potential for literary study, which gets lost somewhere between subscription bookselling's bad reputation and Mark Twain's good one. By making room for Bella Z. Spencer, we make room for the rich complexity and infuriating contradiction of authors and works which circulated through the subscription network, enticing thousands into the ranks of the nation's readers, or at least book buyers. In doing so, we restore a vital context for understanding the broader American book culture of the mid to late 19th century. Thank you.